Hi, I'm Peter Adamson, and you're listening to the History of Philosophy podcast, brought to you with the support of King's College London and the Leverhulme Trust. Welcome to the first episode, Everything is Full of Gods, in which I'll introduce the podcast and tell you about the first Greek philosopher, Thales. In this series of podcasts, I'll be telling the whole history of philosophy, without any gaps. In time, I hope we'll cover pretty much every figure in ancient, medieval, and modern philosophy. Not only the greats, like Parmenides, Plato, Aristotle, Aquinas, and Descartes, but also philosophers who may not be as famous, but who had their own part to play in the history of philosophy. Later on in this episode, I'll be turning to the first of them, Thales of Meletis. He may not be a household name, but he was the very first ancient Greek philosopher, which also makes him the very first Western philosopher. In addition to being first, he had some rather striking ideas. We'll find out, for instance, that he thought magnets have souls. But we philosophers like to define our terms before we begin, so let me start by explaining what I mean when I say telling the whole history of philosophy. Let's start with the word whole. I'll be concentrating on the Western philosophical tradition, partly because that's what I know about, and partly because I want to tell a single continuous narrative, which is hard to do if you try to deal with Chinese and Indian philosophy. But we will be spending some time on philosophy in the Islamic world, a subject dear to my own heart. As I say, I want to cover this territory without any gaps, this being the slogan of the podcast. Of course, this is more of an aspiration than a promise. Sharp-eared listeners may occasionally feel that I've left out a figure or an idea deserving of mention, or even of lengthy discussion. But the point is that I will not just be skipping from highlight to highlight the way a lot of university courses on history of philosophy have to do, where one jumps straight from, say, Aristotle to Descartes, leaving out a couple of thousand years in between. Rather, I want to tell a continuous story so you can see how each thinker builds on those who came earlier, but also strikes out in new directions. That brings us to the word history. Obviously, the history of philosophy isn't quite like other areas of history. This isn't going to be mostly about events, when and why they happened, and which important people were involved. Nor is it the sort of history that paints a picture of another time, maybe by focusing on people who weren't so important, peasants instead of potentates. But on the other hand, the historian of philosophy can't ignore these things. We're going to see that political, social, and religious forces had a lot to do with the way philosophy progressed, and even the fact that philosophy could happen at all. It's an obvious but easily overlooked fact. Philosophy occurs only in a society that can produce philosophers. Usually this has meant that philosophy happens not too far away from wealth and power. It's naive to think that philosophy can happen without economic and political support, even if it's also cynical to think that philosophy is never anything more than an expression of political and economic power. And of course, for the period we'll be studying, historical forces didn't only help to determine who the philosophers were and what they thought. They also determined whether and how their ideas reached us. For most of the time between the ancient Greeks and ourselves, it was extremely laborious and therefore expensive to transmit philosophical writings. They had to be copied by hand. We know about Greek and Latin ancient philosophy only thanks to manuscripts written in the medieval period, a manuscript being, as the word literally says, a text that is handwritten. Many periods of philosophical activity were sparked by massive efforts to translate philosophical texts into a new language. For instance, as we'll see eventually, philosophy in the Islamic world arose because of the translation of Greek scientific texts into Arabic, and this all cost money. Just as much as at other times and places, this holds true of 6th century BC Greece, which is where our story begins. What was it that allowed philosophy to start there and then? Well, the first thing to realize is that Greek philosophy actually didn't start in Greece. It started in the territory called Ionia, which is where the western coast of Turkey now is. This is where you get to if you start in Greece and go around or across the Aegean Sea towards the east, which is exactly what Greek-speaking peoples had done well before the 6th century BC. The ancient Greek historians tell us that in about 1100 BC, in response to an invasion of mainland Greece by a people they called the Dorians, many inhabitants of mainland Greece crossed over to Ionia. That name, Ionia, comes from a legendary leader of the colonists, Ion. These refugees set up a number of colonies, some of which became extremely successful. One of the earliest colonies was Meletis, the city where philosophy would, in due course, be born. It was founded by a group who came from around Athens, the future home of Plato and Aristotle, and one of the few places in mainland Greece not to fall to the Dorians. At least that's what the ancient historians tell us, and the claim is supported by similarities between the Ionian dialect and the dialect they spoke near Athens, which is called Attic Greek, Attica being the area surrounding Athens. By the time of Thales and his successors, Miletus was a rich and successful city. Just like Australia in the 19th century, Miletus went from colony to independent economic power on the back of sheep. Their wool was exported across the Mediterranean. Miletus and the other Ionian cities became wealthy enough to found colonies of their own, as far away as Italy, but also around the Black Sea, which was an area of strength for the Milesians in particular. Miletus was pretty far south in Ionia, and their location and success as traders meant that someone living in Miletus could easily be exposed to ideas and people from further inland to the east and from Egypt. So it's always been tempting to say that Thales and the other Milesian thinkers got some of their ideas from Eastern or Egyptian traditions. For instance, Thales was famous for having predicted a solar eclipse in 585 BC. And if he really did that, he may have been using Babylonian astronomical tables to pull off the trick. There's also some evidence that Thales went to Egypt in person. Miletus, then, was a good place to be in the early 6th century BC if you wanted to become the first ever philosopher. But even Miletus wasn't the sort of town where you could just relax and gaze at the stars trying to figure out when the next eclipse might be coming along. It would be a while before a Greek author would describe full-time philosophy as anything like an ideal or desirable life. On this point, Aristotle makes particularly good reading for us philosophers. He explains to us that we are not, contrary to appearances, just leeching off society when we sit around reading books and having ideas. To the contrary, we are the highest achievers, the ones who realize human potential most fully. But full-time speculation was not Thales' style anyway, or so it would seem. He was no detached contemplator, more of an all-purpose wise man. In fact, he was named as one of the so-called 7 sages of the early period of Greece. Another one of the 7 you might have heard of is Solon, who set down many of the laws governing Athens. Thales' political engagement is best shown by a report that he urged a political union between all the Ionian cities, so that they could resist their neighbors to the east, a policy which, had it been adopted, might have enabled the cities to remain independent for longer than they did. In fact, only a few decades after the time of Thales, Miletus and other Ionian cities fell under the dominion of the Persians. A bit more fun, and also showing a practical turn of mind, is the story about Thales and the olive presses. Supposedly, Thales' knowledge of weather conditions enabled him to predict a bumper crop of olives in the coming season. He went around and cornered the market on olive presses, so that he could make a fortune when the predicted crop came in, and everyone needed to turn their olives into oil. But on the other hand, Plato tells a story about Thales walking along, looking at the sky, and falling into a well because he isn't watching where he's going. Conveniently for this anecdote, there's a servant woman on hand to laugh at him, underscoring the point that philosophers don't notice the world at their feet because they're so busy looking at the sky. Since I myself am capable of smashing my toe into a stone step while trying to go into a house and read a book at the same time, I have a lot of sympathy for the Thales who fell down the well. But the evidence we have suggests that we should instead imagine Thales as a well-rounded fellow, engaged with the world around him as well as with the nature of the world as a whole. What kind of evidence do we have about him, then? I was talking a minute ago about the difficulty of transmitting philosophical ideas across the generations, even in, say, the medieval period, which is 1.5 millennia closer to us. We can double this difficulty for ancient philosophy, and triple it for Thales and the other earliest Greek thinkers. The phrase used for these early philosophers is the PreSocratics, the ones who lived before Socrates, even though, as we'll see, some of the so-called PreSocratics actually lived at about the same time as Socrates. For all of these figures, our knowledge is really based on nothing more than tantalizing scraps. People who work in the field call these scraps fragments. But even this makes the situation sound better than it usually is. What we've actually got is works by later ancient authors, or rather copies of works by later ancient authors, who tell us something about, say, Thales or Heraclitus. Occasionally we're in luck, and they quote the early Greek thinkers verbatim, or even better, say they are going to quote them verbatim, and then do so. Some of these thinkers wrote in poetic verse, which has meter. This, of course, makes it much easier to tell if it's a direct quote. But often what we've got is a much later thinker telling us what an early thinker thought, and we have to decide for ourselves how close this might be to the original wording or idea. Technically, these paraphrase reports are called testimonies rather than fragments, but it isn't always easy to tell the difference. Even if you are lucky enough to have an authentic fragment, it isn't necessarily obvious where the useful information starts and stops. One of our richest sources for the PreSocratics is Aristotle, and he has a tendency to mix reports of what they thought with educated guesses about why they thought what they thought. Plus, he's almost always forcing the PreSocratics into the framework of his own theories, trying to make his predecessors look like they were groping towards the sublime insights of Aristotle himself. Some of what I've already mentioned shows the problems we're facing here. That story about falling in the well is a nice story, but maybe it's a little too nice. It sounds more like an amusing anecdote that's been assigned to Thales because he's a famous philosopher, the way witty remarks get ascribed to Oscar Wilde or Dorothy Parker, even though they didn't say them. In the case of Thales, the problem is particularly difficult, and I should admit before we go any further that almost nothing can be said about him for sure. But since we've got a podcast to finish off, and since, after all, he's the first philosopher, we'll do the best with what we've got. So, what are his big ideas? Some of the things I already mentioned give a flavor of one major dimension of his achievement. He was a scientist, in something like the sense we would use the term. If we know anything about him for sure, it's that he was interested in astronomy. The story about the olive presses also shows that Thales had expertise in what we would call the physical sciences, or at least had a reputation for having that expertise. This is confirmed by some other evidence. There's a story about him diverting a river into two branches so that it would be possible to cross it, because each of the two branches would be shallower than the single river. And although Thales may not, in fact, have written anything at all, some sources tell us that he did write a book about navigation at sea. All this is typical of early Greek philosophy, and in fact of philosophy right up until the modern period. As we'll see many times, the tendency to separate philosophy from what we call science is a recent phenomenon, and certainly not one most Greek thinkers would have recognized. So this is one reason to say that Thales was the first philosopher. He was the first person to gain a reputation for the sort of independent analysis of nature we describe as scientific. For this reason, it's traditional to describe Thales and the other PreSocratics as being rational, as opposed to the presumably irrational culture that went before them. But this isn't a very useful way of looking at it. The main texts we have to illustrate Greek cultural beliefs before the time of Thales are the works of Homer and Hesiod. Homer's Iliad and Odyssey would in fact have been, already for the PreSocratics, the greatest touchstones of Greek culture. In the ancient Greek world, they had the sort of role that the Bible did in medieval Europe, and that Shakespeare does for us, or used to have when people knew their Shakespeare. Clearly, the Iliad and the Odyssey aren't philosophical texts, but neither is Homer irrational. The Iliad is, among other things, a reflection on, as it says in its first line, the sources and consequences of the wrath of Achilles. And you could argue that Homer has a greater insight into cause and effect in the human sphere than most PreSocratics have into the cause and effect of the world around us. The fact that Homer often invokes the agency of a god or goddess to explain what is happening in the Trojan War, or Odysseus' long voyage home, only counts as irrational if you think it's irrational to believe in the gods. Closer to the aim of pre-Socratic philosophy is Hesiod's Theogony, a poem setting out stories about the origins and natures of the gods, probably in part by collecting previous material. Some of this looks more or less explicitly cosmological, in a way that is not too distant from the kind of pre-Socratic cosmology we'll be talking about over the coming episodes. Sure, Hesiod equates his gods and goddesses with his cosmological principles. The Greek word Uranos means heaven, and is also the name of a god in Hesiod, for example. But again, it's hard to make a good case for Hesiod being irrational. He's laying out a theology, and that theology is at least meant to be consistent and explain something, or even explain everything. And if you think theology can't be rational, just wait till we get to Aquinas. So, I think a better way of understanding the pre-Socratics would be to say that their views were at least implicitly grounded in arguments. This, to me, is the core of what philosophy is, and is the difference between early Greek philosophy and other early Greek cultural productions. We mostly have too little evidence about Thales to reconstruct the arguments that gave rise to his views, but Aristotle was probably right to try to reconstruct arguments of some sort or another. We can follow his example if we finally turn to Thales's few attested philosophical claims. The best known is that he thought that water was, well, really, really important. It's a little unclear, unfortunately, in what way exactly he thought water was important. Aristotle tells us that Thales believed the world floats upon water, like a piece of wood. Here we seem to have a cosmological view that would be at home in a non-philosophical religious or theological tradition. The heaven, as even Homer says, is like a dome above us, and the world is a disk floating upon the sea under that dome. However, Aristotle tells us something else about Thales and water. He thought that water was a cosmic principle. Here Thales may well have been anticipating arguments that would be made by his immediate successors. For example, as we'll find out in future episodes, various PreSocratics thought that the materials the world is made of were formed out of the condensation or rarefaction of other materials. So perhaps Thales, observing the importance of water for life in plants, animals, and humans, or the earthy residue left after water evaporates into air, decided that in the first instance everything comes from water. Now, probably none of you are thinking, my God, he's right, everything does come from water. But if Thales got to his water principle in this kind of way, then at least it would show him giving a novel explanation of the cosmos, and using a process of argument to get to that explanation. Whether, as Aristotle implies, Thales also thought everything is literally made of water seems more doubtful. To think this, he would have had to have believed that something like rock, which seems eminently dry and solid, in fact consisted of water, and there's no reason to believe he attempted such an account, though an explanation like this would be given, not much later, by another philosopher from the same city, Anaximenes. Another philosophical claim ascribed to Thales is the one I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast. The magnet has a soul, and so does amber, because when you rub it, it will attract things just as a magnet does. What sense can we make of this? Well, Aristotle tells us about Thales and the magnet in the process of asserting that all philosophers associate soul with motion. And Aristotle may be right to say that Thales was already onto this point. There must be a soul in a magnet, otherwise it could not initiate the motion that pulls it and a piece of iron towards one another. Aristotle tells us also that, according to Thales, all things are full of gods. This is a classic bit of pre-Socratic philosophy in the form of a catchphrase. As we'll see, Heraclitus is the master at this style of philosophy. But let's take seriously the claim that all things are full of gods by putting it together with the other idea about magnets. What you get is a nice little argument, which would go something like this. Everything is full of gods, and I'll show you this using the example of the magnet. It seems to be lifeless, but it must have soul because it can initiate motion. So by extension, you should at least be open to the idea that everything has soul, which is divine. That's obviously doing a lot of Thales' work for him by combining two fragments and filling in the gaps, but that, as I hope you'll come to agree over the coming episodes, is what makes the PreSocratics so much fun. We'll go on next time to discuss Thales' successors in Meletis, the wonderfully named Anaximander and Anaximenes. Then, in the third episode, we'll have another chance to think about the rival claims of philosophy and Greek religion, when we get to the provocative ideas of Xenophanes. That's next week and the week after, on The History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps.